Welcome to the Intentional Encourager podcast, where each episode brings you compelling conversations and stories designed to entertain, enlighten, and encourage. And now here's your host, Brian Sexton.
And welcome into the Intentional Encourager podcast. I'm your host, Brian Sexton. Thank you for joining us again today. And the internet, or as we say in West Virginia, the interweb machine is a beautiful thing, because you can take somebody here in Barboursville, West Virginia, and you can connect them with someone in Cape Town, South Africa. And so that's what we're doing today. And we're marrying a couple of podcasts. We are marrying the Meet Me in the Field podcast and the Intentional Encourager podcast. And I'm so honored to have the host of the Meet Me in the Field podcast. He's also an addiction and wellness specialist in South Africa. And we'll get into a lot of things around that. But it's my honor to welcome Freddie van Rensburg to the Intentional Encourager podcast. Freddie, it's nighttime in Cape Town, and it's the middle of the afternoon here in West Virginia. How are you, my friend?
I am so much better for being here and to be able to communicate via the World Wide Web and make this big world of ours a bit of a smaller place and connect on a real plane. So I'm very honored to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, Freddie, I didn't mean to interrupt, but we've got two competing accents here. So you have my United States, West Virginia accent, and the very beautiful, vibrant South African accent. And so
Afrikaans South African accent.
Afrikaans. Yes.
The one that Leonardo DiCaprio tried so well to copy in Blood Diamonds.
You know what? I should just sit back and let you talk, and I'm going to do that. And by the way, Freddie so graciously invited me, and we recorded an episode of the Meet Me in the Field podcast together. And so let me start there with you, Freddie. What's been the most amazing thing to you? I know that in almost the year that I've been podcasting, I can say these are pretty amazing things. And obviously talking to someone in South Africa is certainly that. What's it been like for you having your Meet Me in the Field podcast? And what's been something that has been such an unexpected benefit for you in doing your podcast?
Wow. I love that question. And it's, I wish I could put in words the feeling that I'm feeling. because the most amazing thing about the podcast is the feeling that I get. And that feeling, Brian, is while I'm talking to somebody, it's as if I absorb an energy. I don't want to say their energy, because that means as if I'm sucking somebody's energy out of them, and I don't think that's the case. But the two energies meet, and we build up an amazing connective energy of mutual respect, love, shared experiences. And when I enter recording, invariably I feel so energized, and I feel as if something significant has happened. And that's why I do the podcast. That's why I come back week after week. I think I edited, or I posted episode 161 today.
I am so jealous. I am so jealous, because I am not there with that level of, as I experience some technical glitches here. So I'm going to turn the camera back to you, Freddie. I'm not there yet with that 161 episodes. And I'll tell you this, I love what you just said about the energy in two people having a conversation. That is the whole impetus for the Intentional Encourager podcast. I want someone to be as though they are in the same room with you and I, a part of this conversation. Take me through a moment that you had in an episode where you were absolutely blown away? Because I've had those moments. I had someone share. I'll share this with you, Freddie.
Please
I
do.
had an episode where someone had gone through leukemia twice, had battled cancer, leukemia, and then they mentioned to me in the midst of the podcast that as they were going through their second round of treatment, that their spouse had an extramarital affair on them. And
Oh
so
my
you
word.
take the cancer. That was a moment that took me back. I kind of sat back in my chair as though it was like, that was what I didn't expect that. I wasn't prepared for that. Have you had those moments in recording podcasts where you've had that blowback moment, so to speak, where it's just been like, what was just
Well,
shared with me?
Brian, there's been so many, but the weird one that really stands out for me was in 1999 in Cape Town. I remember it was just before the turn of the millennium, and we had a spate of bomb blastings all around Cape Town, and they were attributed to a group called PAGAT, People Against Gangsterism and Drugs. And the biggest bomb blast of them all was in a pizza place in Camps Bay called St. Elmo's. I don't know if you've got St. Elmo's pizzas in the US. But anyway, so this was on St. Elmo's. It's just on the beachfront in Camps Bay, which is a really, really busy, let's call it a seaside neighborhood. Beautiful little area. And I was doing this podcast with a lady called Mia, and I called her podcast the Nia Ninja, because she's a Nia teacher. And we were talking, and she said, well, I can't remember how exactly it happened, but she was telling about, she started the story about how they were, it was her husband, a very newborn baby, and a friend. The four of them were on the beach, and the wind was blowing, which is typical for the end of the year. And they decided it's actually quite really not nice. They're going to look for a place to just have something to drink or buy to eat. And they arrived at St. Elmo's, and they sat down at the table. And the baby was difficult, and she wanted to get the bottle for the baby or something. And she handed the baby to her husband and bent down to get something in the bag, and the bomb went off.
Oh my.
And and she survived because her head was under the table. Her husband got very seriously injured and went through a long period of operations and different forms of recovery to get back to normal. But the way she told the story, Brian, was so matter of fact, and I kind of, whoa, I felt it if that bomb hit me, kind of. You're telling the story as if
That's
you were going
the
to tell
same
me,
thing
and then he knocked the beer over.
Yeah.
It would have been the same thing.
That's the same thing that happened to me as my guest was telling me about going through that. It was very matter of fact. And I think, Freddie, for people that, you know, I talk a lot about losing my dad very suddenly. For me, it's kind of matter of fact because it was a while back. I processed those grief feelings and things like that. But for some people that hear that story, they have that blowback moment. And so I've got to ask you this. What was the impetus for you starting the Meet Me in the Field podcast? What were you trying to accomplish? What did you think where did you envision it going?
You are bringing the questions, aren't you? I hope you're starting with the big guns and it gets easier as we go along.
It's the hot tea. It's the hot tea. It's the hot tea and coffee combination
I was invited for a casual chat, not for a hot seat conversation. There's a big difference between the two.
This is almost like meet me in the hot zone here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Something like that. Yeah. So, Brian, what happened was that I'm going to give you the long version, if that's okay. So what happened in my life was I grew up in a Christian home, and through a process, which years later I actually figured out what it was, I moved away from God and I moved away from Christianity. And then at the age, so that was at about the age of 17. Between the ages of 17 and 22, I would say, the division happened. And then at the age of 42, I was a full-blown addict, addicted to marijuana, cocaine, actually any form of drug, alcoholic, sex, and I ended up in rehab. And the facility that I was booked in was a 12-step facility. And the 12 steps feature with the word God a lot. And I was confronted with my own belief system. But the 12 steps are also very clear that this is a spiritual program and not a religious program.
Freddie, I've got to ask you, can I jump in here? I've got to ask you. There's a wide gap between 22 and 42. And you went there a little bit earlier than normal, but I'm glad you did. I'm really glad you did. I've got to ask you, I don't think anyone, and now you specialize in addiction and recovery, and I want to talk with you about that. Awesome. But here's where my mind is going right now. No one, and I'm familiar with it. I've spent some time in the addiction recovery disease state myself, working in that space.
Oh, awesome.
We have in our area of the United States, at one time, not so long ago, we were the heroin capital of the United States. We had more heroin overdoses, believe it or not, in Huntington. In one night, Freddie, yeah, about 4 years ago, in one night, Freddie, we had 26 overdoses.
No.
That overloaded our EMS system, our emergency response system.
Yeah.
They used Narcan to revive 25 of the 26. One person passed away.
Word.
But then after that, the stigma came. And so as you're telling that story, did you finally get to a place at 42? Did you have a long period of drug use? Was it a short? Because some people, and I promise I'll get to the question, some people fall into addiction because of circumstances, because of unfortunate happenings.
Yeah.
And some people, it's a slow and steady progression. They start small and it's, well, this won't hurt me. For us in this region, it was OxyContin. There were a lot of people that were getting pain medication, and it was helping them. Then they would be addicted, and then the OxyContin wasn't enough, so they moved up to something harder. Then that wasn't enough. They moved up to something harder. For you, was it an instant? Was it a in the moment kind of thing, or was it a slow and steady progression?
It was a slow and steady progression. And I can honestly say it started at the age of 5, and the addiction manifested itself in various different formats from the age of 5. I would say basically say the first true addiction was to perfectionism. I had to be perfect. Things had to be exactly the way I wanted it, and that was the only acceptable thing. Then when I reached the age of 13, I discovered that I'm a good athlete. I suddenly popped into being fast. And then athletics became my next addiction. And because of the level at which I competed, I didn't like any teenage boy drink or smoked or whatever. I just didn't go that route because
Freddie,
I didn't want.
Hey everybody, Brian Sexton here. I want to tell you about our sponsor, SEO National. SEO stands for Search Engine Optimization. Now what's that, you might say? Well, search engine optimization helps you show up higher on search engines in front of paying customers for words that you as a business owner can monetize. What a great concept. SEO National is owned by my good buddy Damon Burton, who's been a guest here on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Not only has Damon and his team worked with businesses of all sizes, from e-commerce startups to NBA teams and Shark Tank featured businesses, but more importantly, Damon and his team are about transparency, trust, and providing lifetime value. So much so that he still has his first customers after opening SEO National 14 years ago. Let me give you some intentional encouragement and call Damon and his team today at 855-736-6285 or go to www.seonational.com and get a free quote. Freddie, I've got to ask you this, and forgive me for interrupting, but my mind, this is, well, when you talk about this, I've got to pull a little more conversation out of this and take you here for just a moment. As you are counseling folks now in Cape Town, I've got to think that you run into young men that struggle with addiction. Have you ever thought about what Freddie, the counselor, would say to Freddie, the teenager, if you could go back and counsel yourself in that addiction? Have you thought about how you would do it and what you would say to young Freddie van Rensburg as he's struggling through the addiction of not only perfection, but the drive and athleticism?
Yeah. I think one of my specialities is inner child work. I so strongly believe in us as the adult need to go and fetch the afraid, the insecure, the little being inside us who believes that the world is not safe, and therefore develop a lot of coping mechanisms to make the world safe for them. So if Freddie, the 53-year-old man today, could go back to Freddie at any younger stage of his life, my advice would be, whatever you think you need to do, it's just not that important. It is far more important to relax back, to be yourself, no matter what the others say. And I think there's a very cute quote which is ascribed to Dr. Zeus, but which apparently was not what he said. And that is that thing that be who you are and say what to say, because those people, the people who matter don't mind, and those who mind don't matter. Is the message to that young boy would be, it's just not that important. The important thing is that you be yourself, and that you actually try and relax back into life and just enjoy. Because I was like a child who wore his life garment like a diving suit that's one size too small. The anxiety, Brian, if I think back at my childhood, it's just anxiety that I feel. And I never knew that I suffered from anxiety. But it was all anxiety. I just had to make sure that the world works out like Freddie needs it to work out to feel safe. And I'll take you, if I may, take you there, is the event that happened at the age of 5 was that I realized that I don't think the same, and I don't act the same as the other boys in my neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And it suddenly dawned on me, or the thought that the 5-year-old Freddie had was, and because I'm not like the others, I'm bad.
Do you think the perfectionism, Freddie, triggered the anxiety, or did the anxiety trigger the perfection? Because here's where I'm thinking, and here's where my mind is going. Okay. As a young child trying to, and then you become a young adult, and you make the transition, your body changes and things like that. I love what you said there about having to be in control. And that is a sign of perfectionism, is if everything is not as it should be, then there's something wrong. And I can see where if something's out of place, then you become anxious. But I can also see how you can function some days where everything is in place and you still feel like there's something out of balance. There's something out of control. Did you feel like, as you go back and analyze and think back to your life, and I love how reflective and introspective that you are in understanding yourself so well, because I think by doing that self-introspection, you can connect yourself in others that you see, and you go, I know what that looks like. For me, it's grief. Okay. And I don't mean to hijack the conversation. I know what grief looks like in other people because I know what it was like in my own life when I lost my dad suddenly 8 years ago. And so I'm able to recognize it and understand it when I see it, and know that, okay, that person, the grief is causing them to do this. I see it. I understand it. I can speak to it. I can help it because I've been in that situation. For you, as you look back, did your anxiety trigger the perfectionism, or was it the other way around?
I think you're asking me whether what was first, the chicken
it's the egg. Chicken or the egg. Yeah, exactly. The chicken or the egg question.
But what happened for me, Brian, was that the minute I realized that the way I think is unacceptable and it makes me a bad person, that made me anxious. But to avoid the anxiety, I had to be perfect, because my belief was that while I'm perfect, nobody would see my flaws. So my flaws, the fact that I had these fundamental flaws made me anxious, and the fact that people might see it made me anxious, and the fact that I might not be able to hide it through my perfectionism made me anxious. I lived in constant fear that somebody was going to arrive with a hammer and just tap this little veneer mask that I'm wearing, and everything's just going to crumble. And somebody's going to see the real Freddie, and that Freddie is going to be unacceptable. And that scared the living daylights out of me.
When you were a teenager, and I want to go here for just a second. I've been around teenage athletes for the last 6 years, working around high school basketball and things like that. My son was a high school basketball and baseball player. I see what you're talking about in the drive, in the, I would see kids practice basketball and them saying, I can't end on a missed shot.
Yeah.
I can't, I've got to make a shot and then I can. My son did that. And I'm like, we got to go. It's time to go. My wife's texting me like, we got to go.
Yeah.
For you, as a young man with athletics, was it the drive to be great or the drive to be perfect? Because there's a difference there. For someone to be great means that they're able to perform at certain levels. If someone in athletics strives to be perfect, it almost acts as an internal, it's a hyper gear, so to speak, because perfection is inattainable in athletics.
Absolutely.
And so for you, what was that drive for you? Was it a drive to be great and to say, look at how great of an athlete Freddie van Rensburg is? Or was it for you to be great because you wanted to prove to everyone else just how gifted and talented athletically you were?
I would go the great route. And I would even go further to say that the greatest. Because what being the greatest at athletics meant for me was that in our culture, it was always an incredibly status symbol to be the fastest kid in the school. Now, people always refer to, that's the fastest guy.
And let's put some perspective around that, please, if you don't mind me jumping in there. Let's put some perspective around that. In South Africa, there are still people that to this day talk about Oscar Pistorius, the great runner. And you know, the way that he was able to run on prosthetic legs.
Yeah.
And to do the amazing things that he did. And for a short period of time there, I know I knew the respect he commanded here in the United States, but I would have to think in a country like South Africa, someone like him was larger than life in some respects. Was that a desire for you to be nationally known and say, I want people to know all over South Africa who Freddie van Rensburg is? Or was it just a desire to be great in your own community?
Whoa. Now you bring such an interesting thing up, because I wanted to be great. I wanted to be bloody marvelous.
And here's why I asked that. And please, I want to give you a little more color around that and give our audience a little more color around that, because there are people that desire to be great in their hometown or great in their region so they can get in the newspaper or be on TV locally. So when they walk into a restaurant or something like that, people know who they are. Their desire is to be great in the fish tank that they live in. And then there are those that desire to be great where everyone knows who they are. And so that's why I asked you that question, because I have to think as a young man and not knowing and just learning from you about the culture and things that you grew up around, was it more important for you to be nationally known so that anywhere you went in South Africa, people would know Freddie van Rensburg? Or was it just more important for you to be well known and to be great in your community so that everyone that surrounded you in your community, because you talked about hiding behind a mask of perfection, and you felt like that if somebody knew who you really were, taking a hammer and getting that and beating it, did you want to insulate yourself from that just in your hometown, or did you want to take it beyond the four walls, so to speak, of your hometown?
Wow, Brian, the answer is interestingly multifaceted, because my desire for greatness was born from insecurity. So what we're talking about is my aim for wanting to be the best was to be accepted. For people to look at me and accept me for the fact that I'm doing something well or doing something exceptionally well. With that came a vast amount of fear as well, because once you're well known, you're also being scrutinized, and the last thing I wanted was to be scrutinized.
Yeah. Well, every move is on display. If you, let's take it this way. If you play basketball and you're supposed to be the guy on the team that's the best player on the team, and late in the game, you get an opportunity to make the winning shot and you miss it, then people go, well, man, missed a shot, missed the game winner there. Yeah. This is, my mind is just, I'm trying, I want so, and I know the audience is too. That's why I'm going here. That's why I'm continuing to pull a little more conversation out of there, because we all can relate to those times of insecurity where you don't perform to your expectations, and not even as a teenager. I'm talking professionally and as an adult.
Yeah.
In anything that you do where you miss the mark and you fail and things like that. I am so fascinated by what you said about striving to be great, being born of insecurity, when athletics at its core is about failing more times than you succeed. It's about, you're going to lose, even great teams and great winners individually still face losses that haunt them to this day. When you were striving for that, did you have a goal? Let me go here a minute. Did you want to be a professional soccer player, basketball player, to where some young men train for that, Freddie, because they want to set themselves up financially in the future. I want to be a multimillionaire and provide for a lot of young men in our country that are young basketball players. They train and strive so that they can provide financial security for their family because they grew up in very rough circumstances. And so that's the drive and the impetus for them. And when they get that first contract, they're giving back to their family and taking them out of those rough situations. I've got to extrapolate a little more conversation out of that. For you, what was the ultimate goal for your addiction to athletics?
Wow. Maybe I should put things a little bit into context there. Remember, we are now talking about the 80s, the early 80s. Yeah, I went to varsity.
I remember those days.
I went to
I'm
university.
not that much younger than you are, Freddie. I'm 48. So
we're talking about apartheid South Africa, where the whole world had sanctions against us. We were not welcome in world sport. So we never ever thought of a world stage. It was just not there for us. So I think our thinking was already small. The second thing is that we didn't know anything like professional sport at that stage in South Africa. Professional sport came into South Africa in the mid-90s, when people could become professional rugby players. And I think athletics as a lesser popular sport in South Africa became professional possibly here in the 2000s.
Freddie, I've got to ask you this. This is, you are giving us so many layers of
it's a multi-layered concept.
I love this. I am, and I'm sure there are people going, Brian, don't interrupt him. But you mentioned living in apartheid South Africa, and I remember seeing the images as a young teenager, 12, 13, 14, and seeing images from halfway around the world. I've got to ask you this. Did you ever feel a connection between what those living in apartheid were going through and your own struggles internally with what you were going through? Because I could think, and here's why I asked you that question. Okay. So Brian, why would you ask that question?
I think it's a beautiful question, by the way.
Thank you. Sometimes external struggles and internal struggles can connect people together.
Absolutely.
Because there may be a physical ailment or difficulty, and something that because internal struggles, as you well know, Freddie, can be just as debilitating as external struggles.
Absolutely.
And so I wanted to just, and I've got to ask you this. What was it like being a young man in South Africa in the early 80s? Because with apartheid. And I am so glad you brought that up. I remember apartheid, but I wasn't there when apartheid was happening. And I would love to get some more color around that. And here's why I say that. When I was a young man, again, in my early teenage years, I lived in a neighborhood that was founded at that time, 150 years earlier, by former slaves who had escaped from Virginia, which is now West Virginia, to Ohio. They crossed the Ohio River and became free in Ohio. And I lived in Ohio at that time.
Wow.
And so I've always been curious, having lived in a Black neighborhood myself, I've always been curious about how those things were happening across the world. And it was well documented. And I don't want to rehash that. But my curiosity is so aroused by what you just said about that. I've got to go here for just a moment, if you would allow me to do so. And if not, I totally understand. What was it like? What was South Africa like in the early 80s with apartheid and that cloud of apartheid hovering over the country? Because you said there weren't a lot of outside influences as far as professional sports and things like that. It was almost like South Africa was isolated.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. Brian, so I was born in 1967. My parents bought their house in 1960. And the area that they bought the house in was called Triumph, which translates to English is triumph.
Mm-hmm.
The area got its name from a settlement that was called Sophiatown, where all the people of color were in one go relocated out of Sophiatown to Soweto. And the process of relocation gave the area the name of Triumph. I can only but giggle nervously about it because it is so awful. So now I grow up. 7 years later, I'm born still in Triumph, and I grow up in a Christian household. We were Dutch Reformed, and the only Black people I ever see, the girl who comes to clean the house, the guy who comes to work in the garden, and the people who remove our trash. That's my exposure to Black people.
Wow.
Because there's pass laws, so that they carry a pass to come into the neighborhood, and I think by sundown, by 6 or 7 o'clock, they had to leave. They had to be out of the neighborhood. So, and Brian, the weirdest thing about it is, I never thought it was weird. It's just the way it was.
Yeah.
We were taught selective history at school. Remember, the part of what kept apartheid going was the propaganda. So a part of the propaganda was that we at white schools, we are not supposed to know what's happening in the world. We are not supposed to really know what's happening in South Africa. When I went to university, I didn't know who Nelson Mandela was.
Wow.
Why not? Because I wasn't supposed to know who Nelson Mandela was. The propaganda worked. And it is so weird because I was so embarrassed about it when we eventually learned who Nelson Mandela was and what all the issues was, and apartheid and the atrocities and the killings and the human rights violations and everything. And suddenly the world opened up to us. I was too embarrassed to say to any of my friends, who is Nelson Mandela? I pretended to know. Now you will, if you listen to a few of my podcast episodes, people I speak to, my age, they also didn't know who Nelson Mandela was. we were not supposed to know.
Wow.
The world as we saw it was the world presented to us the way that it was supposed to be. The newspapers we read were the word that comes up is sanctioned, but it's not true. The newspapers were government papers. You only read what you were allowed to read.
Hey everybody, Brian Sexton. I want you to go check out my new book, People Buy From People, 10 Powerful People Lessons from the Ultimate People Person, my dad. My dad was the ultimate connector and the ultimate intentional encourager. And he shared with me 10 connecting lessons that I'm going to share with you in this book, interwoven with stories and personal anecdotes that will help you really see what connecting is truly all about. If you want to be a more powerful, stronger, deeper connector, whether you're in ministry or leadership or sales, you own a business, whatever you want to do that connects you with people and you want to connect with them stronger, deeper, and more powerfully, People Buy From People is for you. I want you to go to Amazon.com and search People Buy From People, Brian Sexton. And it's available in paperback and Kindle, and coming soon, excited about this, coming soon to Audible. Thank you in advance for picking up a copy of People Buy From People. And now let's get back to a great conversation here on the Intentional Encourager podcast. You know, that reminds me, that brings up this point. In the United States now, there's a shift happening as well too, with the media and things like that, because people that are conservatives politically are not given the same liberties on social media platforms as those with liberal agendas and things like that. Yeah. And we're seeing it, and it's causing an uproar here. And again, what you're saying is this, at least I believe this is what you're saying, is that when we teach selective history, when we only allow certain paradigms, certain philosophies, certain ways to be, instead of the free marketplace of ideas that our country in the United States was built on. Now, all of a sudden, we're starting to see that marketplace shrink, and it's the ideas that are propagated by our media. And I can only imagine, Freddie, now I'm starting to think, how differently would my thought processes have been if in my middle school and my high school, I was taught selective history? There were parts that were hidden from me or weren't shared with me. I just, that is so powerful, what you just said there. And how when you went to university, you kind of faked your way through it and said, well, sure, I know who Nelson Mandela is. Yeah. Deep down going, they might as well have been talking about someone from a distant planet.
Absolutely. They might have been speaking about the Prime Minister of Slovakia.
Yeah.
No, it made no difference to me. You know, the year that I went to university, which was 85, my student number starts with 85. That was the second year that our university allowed colored students to attend our university. I went through pure white primary school, pure white high school. And we're not talking about blacks, we're talking about colored people.
Yeah.
I went to Rand Afrikaans University.
Wow.
We didn't speak English.
Wow.
Because Afrikaans was the language. It was the language of the government.
Wow. So you grew up.
We never questioned it.
And you grew up in a society where the government controlled everything.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
They are still busy now with with court cases of families who are suing the certain entities of the government to find out what really happened to their husbands and their fathers in the 60s and 70s and 80s.
My. And I've got to think now, as you look back through the lens of 35 years later, how different our world is with that, and how far we've come, but still how far we have to go.
Absolutely.
And so I don't want anyone to mistake. This is powerful conversation, because I want to be very clear. The Intentional Encourager podcast is for everyone. Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, it makes no difference. This podcast, and I have had people of all different creeds. And the reason I'm asking these questions about Freddie, I want to understand more about that time. I want to open my understanding, because this world is full of incredible people all over the globe, no matter the skin color and things like that. Now, South Africa is much different. Is it not? I mean, let's fast forward 35 years. What do you think the greatest lessons were learned that people say, no matter what, we're never going back to this as a people, as a society? What do you think some of those lessons are?
And your question actually wants to make me cry, as in seriously.
Me too, Freddie.
I am so afraid.
Yeah,
I'm so afraid that we haven't learned the lesson.
Yeah.
I am so afraid that what we've gone through wasn't enough to teach us to never let something like that happen again.
Well, and again, I'm glad we're having this conversation, and I intentionally took it this way because you and I both have podcasts that hopefully reach people, and what we're trying to do is have different conversations.
Yeah.
I don't want to have, you mentioned when you were a child thinking differently. I love that. And I have intentionally purposed that I'm going to think differently. I could have done a podcast about anything. I want to tell stories like this and to have conversations like this where we can delve deep and someone can go, I went through that same thing.
Yeah.
I know what it's like to be such a perfectionist that it tore me up inside.
Yeah.
I've got to ask you this, and I want to be respectful of your time. I want to pivot here for just a moment. Take me through the greatest obstacle that you've ever faced in your life, whether you can expand a little more on the addiction and ending up in rehab, what have you, and tell me the greatest lesson that you learned from it.
Greatest obstacle? To accept my sexuality. And that started at 5. The thought process that happened at 5, where I was different, was when I realized that I'm not like the other boys. But it took me many, many years to figure out that what was wrong with me, and I use wrong in inverted commas, because I don't think there was anything wrong with me, but from the perspective of the South Africa that I grew up in, it was illegal to be gay. When I did military service in 1980, let me count the years. 89, 90, it was still compulsory military service, 2 years. I studied psychology at university, and I did an honors degree in sociology. So when I went into the military, I was co-opted into the Military Psychological Institute, and I worked for the division who helped people who did all the selection, the testing for people who wanted to join permanent force, who wanted to do officers courses, who wanted to get government bursaries to study medicine, all those type of things. One of the major criteria that we were told in that division is if you identify what they refer to beautifully as gender role identification problems. So in other words, if you think somebody's gay, you are not allowed to approve their tests. You have to shoot them down.
Hmm.
So for me, growing up in the late 60s, early 70s, the idea of being gay was so foreign. Number one is that a lot of Afrikaans families in South Africa in those days were very, very conservative, politically conservative, religiously conservative, culturally conservative. Sex and sexuality were never discussed with us. So it involved for me a vast unknown. Not only was I introduced to what was okay and acceptable, but I had to figure out the not okay and the not acceptable, and to realize that I fall in that category. And that's where the perfectionism and athletics came in, because while I ran and while I was the best athlete, nobody questioned my sexuality because I was bringing in the points.
Mm-hmm.
I was carrying the flag for the school. I was bringing in the medals. Athletics made the unacceptable acceptable. So I never really thought about, do I want to run for my country or do I want to? It didn't matter. As long as whatever race I went into the blocks, as long as I won that bloody race by hook or by crook, I was acceptable.
Well, here's the thing too, Freddie. Here's something else, and you've touched on it here as well too. There are things that athletes carry that are also internal struggles and detriments that no one cares about. No one cares about the fact when they get home, they may or may not be abused physically or verbally.
Absolutely.
You know, they may not realize that they lived with a parent or family member. We on an earlier episode, one of my guests talked about being molested as a young man and carrying that. So so struggles, people, all they see is the performance and they see nothing behind the scenes of what that person carries into their life. Maybe they're dealing with parents that are alcoholics.
Absolutely.
To your point, with working with people that are addicted, you struggling with addiction to drugs and alcohol yourself. They may not realize that kid, when they go home, they're going to have to pick their parents up out of the floor because they've gone on the parents didn't bother to show up for the game.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they're going to, or they, in another episode, a young man that I had on the episode was telling me about having to go and physically remove the alcohol from his father's home at 16, 17, 18 years old, and then getting into addiction himself. So you're talking about real struggles. It doesn't matter what the struggle is. Everyone sees what they want to see on the outside.
Yeah.
No one sees, and another one is depression. There are people that struggle with depression.
I'm one of them.
Yeah, and people that have, it's not anything, and that depression may not be an external force, but rather a chemical imbalance that causes the depression and things like that.
That's a category that I fall in,
exactly. I've got to go here, and I want to take our conversation here, and I want to be respectful of your time. This has been powerful, enlightening. This conversation has gone a lot of different places.
Isn't it awesome to not have an agenda?
It really is. It's liberating.
We limit ourselves terribly when we have an agenda.
Yeah. I want you to share with the audience your biggest piece of intentional encouragement, because no matter what someone is struggling with, external, internal forces, leave the audience with your biggest piece of intentional encouragement, Freddie.
That I think that the biggest journey is a journey to self-love. If we can encourage young people to love themselves, I want to put in brackets behind it, unconditionally. What we're going to be able to create is a world of love. And what I mean by that is one thing that I've learned through my own journey of moving from self-hate, and that's why I fell into addiction. I just hated myself so much that I didn't care what I did with myself. I didn't believe I deserved the air that I breathed. And coming into recovery and learning that I need to forgive myself. I need to learn to love myself, and moving from that place of self-loathing to self-love, and realizing that I was incapable of loving until I learned to love myself.
Yeah.
And the only way that I can give love is to have love. I can't give what I don't have. So can you imagine if we could have a generation of people who actually love themselves and can then give that love away?
Yeah.
What a beautiful world we will have. So my greatest encouragement is to take a journey inward, to take the time, take the energy, because you're worth it. Go and find the you inside who is worth loving. Because we were all born, I believe, we were all born through love, in love, for love.
Yeah.
And the answer to whatever the problem is love.
Yeah.
Go inside, see how you would like to be treated in that situation, and take that outwards.
Yeah. That's so good. And Freddie,
Engage life with love.
yes, 100%. And Freddie, that's the thing that's why this podcast exists. My goal is to spread as much intentional encouragement as we can to as many places as we can. It's why you do the Meet Me in the Field podcast. Tell folks how they can find that podcast and how they can connect with you. I am certain after hearing this conversation that people will want to connect with you.
I have a website, which is www.freddie with an IE, that's FREDDIE.org.za. And I also have...
So spell that for the folks. Freddie.org Freddie.org
.za. ZA for South Africa. Zuid-Afrika.
Give us the spelling on that, if you don't mind.
So it's FREDDIE.gov.za. So that's where you can find me. And that's where there's a little bit about me, what I do for a living, about the books that I wrote. And I've got a blog there which I just got really, really so lazy. Writing is actually bloody hard work. Do you realize that? It's so much easier to just...
Yeah, I realized that after I published my first book back in December. Yeah, and we talked about that on your podcast. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I've done two. And I still look at them and think, I did this.
Yeah.
which is quite awesome. Which is like, when did this happen? How did this happen? So there's a blog there. That's also where most people go to find my podcast. But I also post my podcast on a platform called Anchor. And Anchor pushes my podcast then to 9 of the most prominent podcast platforms in the world. So you can find me on iTunes, on Google Podcast, on Spotify, on whatever. And the podcast is called Meet Me in the Field. And then I'm on Twitter, but I was a very active Twitter participant, and my Twitter handle is @RensburgFreddie, and that is RENSBURG and then FREDDIE. But Twitter became toxic for me. It wasn't a friendly environment.
I told someone the same thing earlier. I have backed away from Twitter. I use LinkedIn a lot, but
yes.
connect with
LinkedIn
connect with Freddie on LinkedIn, Twitter, and go
search
search
on LinkedIn as Freddie van Rensburg, and I am on Instagram as Freddie Counselor.
Mm-hmm.
And where else? Facebook. Meet Me in the Field has a Facebook page. Freddie Counselor has a Facebook page. Freddie van Rensburg has a Facebook page. And strangely enough, that Freddie on Facebook is spelled with a Y. Why? I don't know.
Maybe they thought you were a West Virginian, Freddie. That's all I can think.
Why and how that happened, I don't know.
Freddie, this has been fabulous, fascinating conversation, and I have enjoyed it thoroughly. Listen, this will probably go down as one of the most powerful episodes of the Intentional Encourager podcast. And it's not because of me, it's because of my incredible guest, Freddie van Rensburg. Freddie, thank you for joining me today on the Intentional Encourager podcast.
This has been an amazing experience, and I'm honored and humbled to have been asked. Thank you so much.
My thanks as always to producer Bryce Sexton and technical advisor Matt Means. And the ultimate thanks goes to the Lord Jesus Christ, who provides intentional encouragement every day through His Word. And until next time, remember, everyone, everywhere, at any time and any place can be an intentional